From the first moment that the opening chords to his now iconic theme song played for the very first time back in 1962, Fred Rogers, the host of beloved children's TV series Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, captured the imagination of a generation of youths across America and the entire world. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, a PBS-produced series, ran from October of 1962 until August 2001, spanning a grand total of 912 episodes, becoming, at the time, the longest-running children's TV series ever. Mr. Rogers holds a special place in the hearts of many across the world, and ever since his passing in February 2003, a renowned focus has been placed on remembering the hope and optimism that he and his show brought to the world, whether it be tackling real-world events, breaking down racial barriers, or communicating and understanding children in a way never really seen on television previously. It's fair to say that the impact of Mr. Rogers' work is still very much felt today. I have been personally fascinated by the story of Fred Rogers for a number of years, intrigued by both his character and the way he redefined children's television, and the real individual behind the cardigans and the puppets. So in this video, I want to dive into the legacy and the history of Fred Rogers, explore the factors that went into making Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood such a timeless and beloved series, the lessons we today can learn from his teachings, and why it's important to keep the memory of Mr. Rogers alive, and the everlasting importance that this real-world hero has on the world. So, in order to gain an understanding of the thought process and the ideas behind Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I think it's first important to explore Fred Rogers as a person, his background, and how his beliefs shaped the larger-than-life figure that he would ultimately become. Frederick McFeely Rogers was born on the 20th of March 1928 in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, the son of a successful businessman named James Rogers and entrepreneur Nancy. Growing up as an only child until the age of 11 when his parents adopted his younger sister Elaine, Fred spent much of his youth using his imagination, playing with puppets, toys and learning to use the piano, all skills that would become instrumental in his later career. He studied at Latrobe High School before enrolling and graduating from Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, with a degree in music composition. Soon after, in 1951, he was hired by NBC as an assistant producer on the classical music radio show The Voice of Firestone. However, this job involved Fred leaving his home state of Pennsylvania and moving to New York, with Fred ultimately choosing to return home 2 years later, working as a program director for the newly established public broadcast channel WQED. The birth of this collaboration between Fred and WQED would be the starting point for what would later become Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Whilst working for the network, Fred developed a show entitled The Children's Corner, which premiered in August of 1955. The show was hosted by Josie Carey, whilst Fred worked off-camera to develop puppets, characters and music for the show. It was around this time, though, that another one of Fred's lifelong passions began to emerge, as while he was working on the Children's Corner, he began to study to become a Presbyterian minister, eventually graduating from the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and being ordained by the United Presbyterian Church in 1963. Now, Fred's faith very much informed his outlook and his attitudes towards his later work, as he explained in a 1983 interview, "I want to be a vehicle for God, to spread his message of love and peace. And while this video isn't intended to analyse religion or faith in any particular way, I do think it's important to highlight how the values and ideals of Fred's faith shaped the way that he'd approach television, both in front of the camera and behind it." Not long after he was ordained, though, Fred was approached by the Canadian Broadcast Company to host a series of 15-minute episodes of a children's TV series entitled Mr. Rogers, marking the first time that Fred would ever formally appear on screen. This show, which lasted from 1963 to 1967, served to be very much of a precursor to his eventual PBS series, with Fred portraying the character of Mr. Rogers in a show which featured a variety of puppets, trolleys, songs, and many of the other aspects that would become synonymous with the neighbourhood. In 1967, Fred acquired the rights to the series from CBC and relocated with his family back home to Pittsburgh. He could now return to WQED, the network in which he'd made his name, with a brand new idea for a children's television show. And in February of 1968, It was time for the world to meet its neighbour. Mr. Rogers' Neighbourhood premiered on the 19th of February 1968, initially airing on the regional Eastern Educational Network, and the hallmarks of what this series would become are evident from the very first episode. It opens with a camera sweeping through the village of make-believe before arriving at the home of beloved neighbour Mr. Rogers, as he arrives home and welcomes the world with his now iconic theme song, "Won't You Be My Neighbour?" The early episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighbourhood not only showcase the style and tone of what the series would become, but also the reactions and responses that it would garner. By the end of 1968, the series was nominated for an Emmy for Outstanding Achievement in Children's Programming, with Fred also nominated as an individual. Throughout its 912 episodes, there is no shortage of memorable moments to discuss from the show. Everyone likely has their own favourite Mr. Rogers story or song. But there are three in particular that I want to just touch on here that I believe best exemplify the values and the ideals that the show represents. As the 1960s rolled into the 1970s, Mr. Rogers' Neighbourhood maintained its place as a beloved children's series, and with this in mind, Fred and the team behind the show began to use their platform to not only entertain children, but also educate and inform them on larger social issues. Maybe the best example of this came in June 7th, 1968. You see, 2 days earlier, Robert Kennedy, the brother of former President John F. Kennedy and the current Senator for New York, was shot and killed in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, California. The death of a major political figure rocked the American people to its core. Compounding this was not only the harrowing reminder of his brother's death 5 years prior, but the fact that only 2 months earlier, the world woke up to the news that civil rights activist Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had also been shot and killed. Assassination was a hot topic across the news at this time, and Mr. Rogers felt like it was right to tackle this concern head on. So on June 7th, 1968, a primetime special entitled The Mr. Rogers' Neighbourhood Assassination Special was aired. This episode starts in the largely usual Mr. Rogers format, before Daniel Strike Tiger chillingly asks Lady Aberlin, "What does assassination mean?" Lady Aberlin almost seems taken back for a second, before asking Daniel where he'd heard that word, and what does he already know about assassination. The pair talk about what they've seen on the news, with Aberlin assuring Daniel that everything would be okay, and that feeling worried or scared about what they'd seen on television is natural. This sentiment is echoed by Fred himself, who in the episode's closing monologue states that the best thing in the world is for your children to be included in your family ways of coping with the problems that present themselves anytime, but particularly now, in this very difficult time in our nation. Behind the scenes, Fred felt personally concerned with the way in which mainstream news outlets were covering the deaths of Kennedy and Dr. King, worrying the graphic natures in which they were being discussed, and the impact that it would have on very young children. Watching this episode back some 51 years later, it's almost astonishing how well Fred and those involved in the show managed to touch on such a heavy and topical issue, and did so in such a calming and reassuring way. To me, this exemplifies one of the things that fascinates me most about Fred Rogers. His show, while clearly aimed at children, spoke to adults and entire families so much. Fred was just as much talking to parents as he was to the kids, offering his advice and suggestions on what to do when they're unsure, just as any friendly neighbour would. There are two other examples that spring to mind when I think of the impact that Mr. Rogers had throughout his years on the air. Francois Clemens was an Alabama-born actor who played the role of the friendly neighbourhood policeman, often dropping in on the show to see Fred and his friends. Clemens in this role was one of the first African-American actors to have a recurring role on a children's TV series, and while his race and his background were never used to define his character, Officer Clemens was both a beloved neighbour to Fred Rogers and a respected figure of authority. While segregation was legally abolished a number of years prior, the struggle for black citizens to be accepted and treated equally by 1969 was very much at its height. Community pools was one of the areas in which, unfortunately, some form of segregation was still enforced. The striking images of black swimmers being met with acid poured into the water in a motel in Florida in 1964 were still heavy in the minds of many. With this knowledge in mind, Fred performed an action so simple and straightforward, yet so radical and overtly political that it couldn't be ignored. On the 9th of May 1969, Fred invited Officer Clemens to join him dipping his feet in a small plastic pool in his yard, with the two sitting together, feet alongside each other in the pool, breaking down racial barriers in the process with such a simple gesture. As Clemens later explained, it was a definite call to social action on Fred's part. That was his way of speaking about race relations in America. The third and final moment from the show that I want to touch on here came a few decades later in February of 1981. By this point, Mr. Rogers was more than just a household name across the United States. He was truly an institution, a multiple generation spanning neighbour who was held firmly in the hearts and minds of so many. One of these people who felt such a strong connection to Fred was Jeffrey Erlinger, a young child who was left paralysed following an operation to remove a spinal tumour. Before his surgery at the age of 5, he was asked by his parents what he would like when he recovers, and he said he would love to meet Mr. Rogers. His sister wrote and sent a letter explaining Jeff's story to Fred, who then travelled to Wisconsin to meet the family. This meeting between Jeff and Fred clearly had a profound impact on both, as a number of years later, Fred reached out to Jeff's family and invited the now 10-year-old child to be a guest on his show. On February 18, 1981, Jeff Erlinger made an unscripted appearance on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, visiting Fred and showing him his new electric wheelchair, with the pair openly discussing his condition, his chair, and how he handles days when he feels sad, before the two together sung the song, "It's You I Like." This exchange between Fred and Jeff is one of the most genuine and heartfelt moments you'll ever see on any television show. And the story between the two could end here, but it doesn't. In 1999, Fred Rogers was inducted into the Television Hall of Fame, and at the ceremony, a number of guests appeared on stage to thank Fred for his service to children's television. However, before Mr. Rogers got up to accept the award, one final guest was invited onto the stage, as a now 29-year-old Jeffrey Erlinger arrived on stage. Fred's reaction to this is absolutely heartwarming, as he without hesitation leaps onto the stage to embrace Jeff and thank his longtime friend for sharing this moment. And it's arguably this moment above all else that speaks to the character of Fred Rogers best. He's a man that truly cared and loved everyone that he seemed to come in contact with. He saw us for our very best, and just like he sang in his songs, liked us for who we are. With all of these incredible stories about Mr. Rogers, you'd feel remiss for believing that the myth exceeded the man. Surely someone could not be so wholesome and genuine, right? This was the belief held by Tom Junod, a journalist who in 1998 was tasked to write an Esquire piece on Mr. Rogers for a column about heroes. As he recalls, "I was assigned the story about Fred because one of the editors at Esquire thought it would be amusing to have me, with my stated determination to say the unsayable, write about the nicest man in the world." However, upon interacting and becoming close with Fred, even someone like Tom was won over by the sincerity and the unwavering kindness that Mr. Rogers demonstrated each day. His eventual piece, entitled "Can You Say Hero?", is a testament to the person that Fred Rogers was. He writes that once upon a time, a man named Fred Rogers decided that he wanted to live in heaven. Heaven is the place where good people go when they die, but this man, Fred Rogers, didn't want to go to heaven. He wanted to live in heaven here now, in this world. And so one day when he was talking about all the people that he loved in his life, he looked at me and said, "The connections we make in the course of a life, maybe that's what heaven is, Tom. We make so many connections here on earth. Look at us. I've just met you, but I'm investing in who you are and who you will be, and I can't help it." And I'm not ashamed to say that for a period of time, I shared the same skepticism towards Mr. Rogers, until I was fully engrossed and exposed to his story with the 2018 documentary Won't You Be My Neighbour. It was the myth that I was largely familiar with, not the man himself, and usually myth exceeds man, but Fred isn't any ordinary individual. It's not hyperbole for me to say that Fred Rogers, the individual and the man, is just as brilliant as the legend and the idea of what Mr. Rogers was and what he represented. I don't even feel fully comfortable calling Mr. Rogers a character, because that was simply Fred, just dressed in a cardigan and comfortable shoes. The legacy that Mr. Rogers holds in revolutionising children's television simply cannot be understated. But as Paul Hendrickson described in a 1982 Washington Post article, Fred wasn't just a hero for his 3 to 5 year old audience. Instead, he was a memory code to lost childhood. Fred Rogers spoke to all of us and connected with all of us with nothing but sheer sincerity and kindness. The world felt a little bit better for having Mr. Rogers in it, and I think it's important for all of us to remember and keep hold of the values, ideals and the messages that he tried to teach everyone. Because even with Fred himself gone, the legacy and the idea of Mr. Rogers lives on in those very things, and now it's our duty to make sure that a little piece of Fred Rogers stays alive inside our own personal neighbourhoods.
I know how tough it is some days to look with hope and confidence on the months and years ahead, but I would like to tell you what I often told you when you were much younger. I like you just the way you are. It's such a good feeling to know that we're lifelong friends.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on the video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on Mr. Rogers. What are your memories of watching the show? Did you watch the show as a child? And looking back at the shows and everything that he accomplished in his life, what does Fred Rogers and Mr. Rogers' Neighbourhood mean to you? Let me know down below. I can't wait to hear what you have to say as always. If you're new to Owen Likes Comics, please consider hitting the subscribe button so you stay up to date with all of the new videos we make. And there should be some other videos on screen right now that you might also enjoy if you enjoyed this one. If you want to help support the channel, you can do so at Patreon and at Ko-fi. Links both will be in the description as well. And if you want some more of me, you can follow me on Twitter just at Owen Likes Comics. That's all for me and with this video, so thank you all for watching so much, and until next time, take care and keep reading.